My wife lost her memory 7 years ago. We thought it was just a tragic accident, a cruel twist of fate that took the brilliant woman I loved and left behind an empty, silent shell. But yesterday, my son and I took her to a new neurologist. When my son stepped out of the room to take a business call, the doctor leaned across his desk. His face was completely pale. He fixed his gaze on me and dropped his voice to a whisper. "Keep your wife away from your son." I hadn't even begun to form a response, hadn't found the words to ask what he could possibly mean when the door swung open behind us. My son came back through it, something clutched in his hands. In that single frozen instant, everything inside me went still. "My name is Roland Everett. Welcome back to Dad Revenge. I'm glad you're here with me today. If this is your first time, take a moment and follow along so you don't miss the stories we share here. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something right now at this early point in the story. Who are you already pulling for, Roland or someone else? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to hear from you. One last thing before we begin: some elements of this story have been shaped for the audio format, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. I am 70 years old, a retired structural engineer, and I am still trying to make sense of the absolute nightmare my life has become. For 4 decades, I raised bridges and commercial high-rises across the country, convinced that a solid foundation could hold against any storm life threw at it. I poured everything I had into providing for my family, building a fortress of security around my wife and my only child. What I never saw coming was that the most devastating collapse would unfold right inside my own home, engineered by the very blood I had spent my life shielding. The air inside Dr. Arthur Crane's examination suite at a neurological clinic in McLean, Virginia, was sharp with antiseptic and rubbing alcohol cold enough to raise the hairs on your arms. I sat in a rigid plastic chair, cradling Clara's fragile hand inside both of mine. My beautiful wife was 68 years old, but the grinding agony of the past 7 years had worn her into someone who appeared far, far older. She sat beside me in her wheelchair, eyes fixed on some generic medical poster across the room, her fingers limp and unresponsive against my palm. Her body was present. Her mind had been sealed away behind a dark, impenetrable wall for years. Standing on the far side of her wheelchair was Garrett, my son. He was 40 years old, dressed in an immaculate, custom-tailored charcoal gray suit. His hair was flawlessly styled, and his heavy luxury watch caught the harsh, fluorescent light with a sharp gleam. He looked every bit the ruthless, successful hedge fund manager he had made himself into. To anyone else sitting in that room, he was the very picture of a devoted son carving time out of a brutal high-stakes schedule to escort his aging parents to yet another specialist. Dr. Crane sat behind his desk, studying his monitor with focused intensity. I had come in believing this was a routine follow-up. I was clinging to the hope that this new, highly recommended physician might offer some experimental approach, or at least a fresh set of eyes on Clara's worsening condition. Dr. Crane had ordered an extensive, comprehensive blood panel a week earlier, something far more thorough than any of our previous doctors had ever run. I watched him carefully. The silence stretched and thickened until it felt suffocating. The only sound was the rapid clicking of his mouse. He did not speak. He scrolled on his brow, creasing deeper with each line he read. I could see the muscles along his jaw pulling tight. Then Garrett's phone buzzed sharply in the breast pocket of his suit. He drew it out, glanced at the screen, and exhaled with a short, exasperated sound. "It's the Dallas office," Garrett said, offering me an apologetic smile that had clearly been rehearsed 1,000 times. "I have to grab this. 2 minutes, Dad." He laid a hand gently on his mother's shoulder, squeezed my arm with practiced warmth, then stepped into the hallway and pulled the heavy wooden door firmly shut behind him. The instant that brass latch clicked into place, the entire character of the room shifted. Dr. Crane swung away from his monitor. The measured professional composure he'd carried since we walked in dissolved completely. The color had emptied from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, waxy gray. He pushed his rolling stool back, rose to his feet, and crossed toward me in 2 quick, urgent strides. He did not use his normal voice. He leaned close enough that I could feel the nervous heat coming off him. His eyes darted to the closed door, then to Clara sitting helpless in her chair, then locked directly onto mine. "Roland," Dr. Crane whispered, his voice shaking with a raw urgency that sent a wave of cold dread through my chest. "Listen to me very carefully, and do not react." I sat completely rigid. My mind was reaching for meaning, but coming up empty, my voice gone entirely. "You need to get her out of your house." He pressed on his whisper, barely a breath, yet thundering in my ears. "I'm looking at her toxicology results right now. Roland, you need to keep your wife away from your son." The air left my body all at once. Keep her away from Garrett." What was he saying? My mind threw the words straight back out. Garrett was the one who funded her costly in-home medical care. Garrett was the one who oversaw every medication, every dose, every schedule. Garrett was the dutiful son who showed up every single day without fail. I opened my mouth to demand an explanation, to ask this man if he'd lost his senses entirely. But before a single word could form, the door handle turned with a firm, decisive click. Dr. Crane snapped back instantly, snatching a clipboard from the counter and dropping his gaze to it, as though absorbed in careful study. The door opened wide. Garrett walked back in. He slipped his phone into his pocket and offered that same smooth, polished smile to the room. But it wasn't the smile that turned my blood cold. It was what he was carrying in his other hand. A tall, red, stainless steel thermos. The paint was chipped near the lid from years of daily use. An utterly ordinary object. One I had seen hundreds of times, yet seeing it now, with the doctor's warning still ringing in my skull, sent my stomach lurching. "All sorted," Garrett said easily, pulling his chair out and settling back beside us. "Sorry about that, Dad. Markets don't pause for anyone." He unscrewed the lid of the red thermos. A faint, earthy, faintly metallic smell drifted out into the sterile clinic air. "Time for your herbal smoothie, Mom," Garrett said. His voice was soft, patient, warm as a saint's. He tilted the thermos slowly toward Clara's chapped lips. For 7 long years, I had watched this same ritual play out. I had watched it with a heart swollen with gratitude for a son who tended so faithfully to his broken mother. But now, with Dr. Crane's desperate warning screaming through my thoughts, every movement Garrett made felt weighted, deliberate, and deeply, terribly wrong. Clara did not look at him. She was still staring at the wall, lost somewhere unreachable. But the moment the cold metal rim touched her bottom lip, something in her stirred. It wasn't a conscious choice. It was reflex, primal, instinctual. Her frail hand jerked weakly upward, nudging the heavy thermos away from her face. The abrupt motion sent the thick, dark liquid sloshing over the rim. Several drops landed directly on my bare wrist. I clenched my jaw, holding myself perfectly still. The liquid was warm, but the instant it soaked into my skin, it produced a strange, sharp burning, a chemical bite like an irritant working into raw flesh. I stared down at the dark stain spreading across my wrist, and my mind lurched backward to a rain-soaked Tuesday afternoon 7 years ago. The sickening, heavy thud that had rolled through our hallway. The blind panic as I ran to find my brilliant, vibrant Clara crumpled at the foot of our grand oak staircase. That fall had supposedly fractured her skull, and over time dismantled her mind entirely. From the day she returned from the hospital, frightened, hollowed out, unrecognizable, Garrett had stepped forward. He had personally sourced and blended this thick, dark botanical tea, delivering it every afternoon without exception. He said it was a premium holistic remedy, something to ease her damaged neurological pathways. I had never once questioned it. I was just an exhausted, shattered husband, doing everything he could to keep the pieces from scattering. But as an engineer, I know this: a fresh coat of paint conceals a crumbling foundation, yet a structural crack always announces itself before the building comes down. Sitting in that cold clinic, feeling the chemical sting on my wrist, and watching the rigid terror in Dr. Crane's eyes, I understood that my family was a structure teetering on the edge of catastrophic failure. I looked back at Garrett's face. He was dabbing the spilled liquid from Clara's chin with a crisp white handkerchief, every movement unhurried and precise. But there was a tightness in his jaw and a cold, locked-in focus behind his eyes that I had never registered until that exact moment. He was not looking at a mother he loved. He was looking at a task that needed finishing, a problem that required management. "Dad, everything okay?" Garrett asked, catching my stare. His voice was perfectly level, perfectly untroubled. I let the muscles in my face go slack. I gave him the tired, bewildered smile of a worn-out old man who leaned entirely on his capable son. "Yes, Garrett," I said, my voice rock-steady despite the hurricane of panic tearing through my insides. "Everything is fine, just a bit worn out today." "Good," he murmured, turning those cold eyes back to his mother. "Come on, Mom. Drink up. It's what's best for you." I sat in that sterile silence, watching my wife swallow the dark liquid, the burn on my wrist pulsing like an alarm I couldn't silence. I didn't say another word. I just watched. But the engineer in me had snapped wide awake. The blueprints of my life had been falsified, and I intended to strip back every wall until I found out exactly who had signed off on the ruin of my family. The elevator ride down and the walk through the underground parking garage were exercises in suffocating quiet. Garrett pushed his mother's wheelchair through the corridors with the practiced ease of a devoted son simultaneously working through emails on his phone with his free hand. I followed a few paces back, my mind churning at full speed. The faint sting on my wrist throbbed beneath my shirt cuff, a steady, insistent reminder of the doctor's hushed warning. "Keep your wife away from your son." The words cycled through my head on an endless loop, swallowing every other sound around me. We reached Garrett's luxury sedan, a gleaming dark silver vehicle that smelled of expensive leather, and pulled Clara from the wheelchair with practiced ease, murmuring small, hollow comforts, then buckled her into the passenger seat. She gazed straight ahead through the glass, completely absent from the world around her. I folded myself into the back seat, sinking into the deep leather, feeling less like a father and more like a captive being driven somewhere he had not chosen. Garrett collapsed the wheelchair, stowed it in the trunk with a solid thud, and dropped into the driver's seat. The engine turned over in a near whisper, and we eased out into the afternoon traffic. For the first 15 minutes, the only sounds were the low hum of tires on pavement and soft jazz playing from the car speakers. I studied the back of Garrett's immaculately groomed head. I needed to probe. I needed to see how the structure reacted when I pressed against a load-bearing wall. I kept my voice mild and slightly raspy, wearing the role of the exhausted, overwhelmed old man like a well-fitted coat. "That appointment was a strange one, wasn't it?" I said. "I have never seen a doctor respond quite like that to a routine blood panel." Garrett glanced at me in the rearview mirror. His eyes were composed, no flicker of alarm, no trace of guilt. "What do you mean, Dad?" he asked, his tone perfectly casual, his focus drifting back to the road. Dr. Crane struck me as entirely professional, a touch rigid maybe, but competent. I shifted in my seat, pressing my stinging wrist against my thigh beneath the sleeve. He looked alarmed. I went on, letting a thread of fatherly concern into my voice. Right before you came back in with the thermos, all the color had left his face. He was saying something under his breath about the test results. It worries a man, Garrett. You know how I worry about your mother. Garrett produced a soft, dismissive laugh, the kind calibrated to make a concern sound foolish without being openly cruel. Dad, you have to understand how these neurologists operate. They see a number that doesn't match the textbook and they spiral. They have no imagination. I let the quiet hang for a moment before pressing a little further. He seemed particularly focused on what Clara was being given. I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the back of his neck. That smoothie you prepare for her. What exactly goes into that red thermos, son? You have been making it every single day since she came home from the hospital 7 years ago. I know you say it settles her nerves, but what are the actual ingredients? Garrett didn't flinch. His shoulders stayed loose. He simply reached out and touched the digital display on the dashboard. Let's get Nadine on the line, he said, his manner entirely reasonable. She handles sourcing the supplements. She can walk you through it better than I can. The phone rang twice before she picked up. Nadine's voice filled the car, bright clipped, and laced with the particular brand of condescending sweetness she reserved for me. Garrett, darling, is everything all right? How did it go with the new doctor? We're heading back now, Nadine, Garrett answered smoothly. Dad has some questions about Mom's daily botanical blend. He says Dr. Crane seemed a little thrown by her blood work today. A sharp, theatrical sigh came through the speakers, the sigh of someone performing long-suffering patience. Oh, Dad, Nadine said, addressing me directly now. Please tell me you didn't let that doctor put ideas in your head. I have warned you about these conventional medicine specialists. They resent any treatment they can't run through an insurance billing code. Nadine, I simply want to know what my wife is drinking, I said, keeping my voice gentle and tired. It is a highly specialized, custom Swiss botanical blend, Dad, she said, her tone sharpening into something authoritative. We import it from a private holistic clinic in Zurich. It contains rare adaptogens and neurosoothing compounds that the regulatory agencies here would never approve. It costs us $2,000 out of pocket every single month, Dad. We pay it without complaint, because it is the only thing that keeps Mom from those terrible, violent tremors. Do you remember how bad she was before we started the regimen? Do you really want her shaking uncontrollably in her bed again? The guilt was deployed with surgical precision, engineered to make me feel ungrateful and wholly dependent on their goodwill. Dad! Nadine continued, her voice shifting into a counterfeit warmth, soft with manufactured hurt. Garrett is up at 5:00 in the morning every day, measuring and blending that mixture down to the milligram. We do it out of love. Don't let some ego-driven clinic doctor undo everything we have worked so hard to build. I settled back into the cold leather and let the performance wash over me. From the outside, it was an airtight story, seamless, well-rehearsed, impossible to poke a hole in. I swallowed carefully and played my part. You're right, Nadine, I said, letting my voice carry just the right note of shame and frailty. I'm sorry. I'm just a frightened old man trying to make sense of things that are beyond me. I am grateful for everything you and Garrett do for her. I truly am. Thank you, Dad, Nadine replied, her patronizing satisfaction complete. We'll see you at home. The call ended, and the car dropped back into silence. You don't need to worry, Dad, Garrett said quietly. I have everything under control. I nodded, watching the back of his suit jacket. Then my gaze fell to the steering wheel. His voice was the portrait of calm, steady authority. but his hands told an entirely different story. Garrett was crushing the leather of that wheel with a force that had turned his knuckles bone white. His fingers were locked in a rigid, desperate grip, his entire forearm trembling against the console. The performance was flawless, but his body was screaming. He knew I had been watching him, and he was afraid of what I might actually be turning over in my mind. The rest of the evening moved through a suffocating fog of enforced routine. We pulled up to our sprawling suburban estate in Fairfax County, Virginia, the house I had designed and built from the ground up to be my family's sanctuary. Garrett helped Clara out of the car with the measured care of a seasoned nurse. He guided her into the living room, eased her down into her favorite recliner, and draped a soft fleece blanket over her frail shoulders. Nadine was already waiting, offering a sympathetic smile and a plate of warm food that I could barely force myself to get down. The two of them moved through the house with complete ownership, managing the caregivers, adjusting the thermostat, conversing in hushed, reverent tones about my wife's heartbreaking condition. To anyone peering through the front window, it would have looked like a portrait of generational love and devotion. But the low, persistent sting on my wrist was a quiet, relentless reminder of the doctor's terrified whisper. "Keep your wife away from your son." I excused myself early, citing the emotional weight of the day. I retreated to the master bedroom, closed the heavy door behind me, and didn't even consider lying down. I paced the dark room, the silence of the house pressing in like something physical. My mind was a storm of memories, medical charts, and the image of Garrett's white-knuckled hands locked around that steering wheel. I am a structural engineer by training, and for 40 years those instincts kept thousands of people from harm. I know how buildings breathe. I know the way they settle into the ground, and I know the precise sequence by which they fail. People outside the profession look at a freshly painted wall and see a flawless, beautiful structure. They admire the crown molding the polished floors. But an engineer doesn't look at the paint. We listen for the hairline fractures forming deep inside the concrete. We measure the millimeter shifts in the load-bearing columns. Standing in the dark of my bedroom, I applied that same discipline to my son. Garrett had painted a masterful facade. The successful hedge fund manager, the devoted child who rose to the occasion when disaster struck the steady anchor for his aging parents. But the foundation was cracking. The sudden panic in the clinic, the elaborate story about a Swiss botanical blend, the white-knuckled grip on that steering wheel, the doctor who looked like he'd witnessed something unspeakable. These were not minor settling sounds. These were the sounds of steel snapping under load. I was certain of it. Around midnight, the house finally went quiet. I heard the muffled sounds of Garrett and Nadine retreating to the guest suite at the far end of the hall. I waited another 30 minutes listening to the faint, rhythmic ticking of the antique pendulum clock in the hallway before silently opening my bedroom door. I stopped in the shadows just outside the kitchen. A single pendant light burned over the marble island. Garrett was standing there, still dressed, suit trousers, crisp white shirt sleeves pushed up to the elbows. He had the red thermos in his hand. I watched from the darkness as he crossed to the secondary medical refrigerator we kept in the pantry. He set the thermos inside on the top shelf. Then he did something that stopped the breath in my chest. He produced a small, heavy brass padlock from his pocket, threaded it through the refrigerator door handles, and snapped it shut. He tucked the key into his pocket, dusted off his hands, and stood there staring at the appliance for a long, calculating moment. Watching him lock that fridge, a buried memory broke through the surface, raw, bitter, unbearable. 7 years ago, in the devastating chaos following Clara's terrible fall down the stairs, my world had caved in entirely. She was in a medically induced coma, her brain swelling, her life suspended by the thinnest possible thread. I could not leave her hospital bedside. I was a wreck, incapable of focusing on anything except the rhythm of her heart monitor. At the time, I was the sole owner and chief executive of a multi-million-dollar commercial construction firm, a company I had raised with my own two hands. Garrett, seeing my complete devastation, stepped in to carry the load. He brought me a temporary power of attorney document, telling me to sign it so he could keep the firm's operations running and manage the substantial financial obligations while I stayed home to care for my broken wife. I signed without reading a single word. I surrendered my life's work, my entire empire, because I trusted my son to guard what we had built. For 7 years, I let him run everything, sealing myself inside this house as Clara's primary caretaker. Now standing in the shadows of my own kitchen, a hideous understanding settled over me. Garrett wasn't securing an expensive holistic remedy to prevent it from being wasted. He was locking away a dangerous substance to guarantee that no one else in the house could ever reach it. He was handling that red thermos the way you handle a hazardous material. It was not medicine. It was a mechanism of control. The pieces of the puzzle were sliding into alignment in my mind, and the picture they formed was monstrous. The rushed transfer of my company, the systematic isolation of my wife, the daily administration of a dark, mysterious liquid that no one else was ever permitted to touch. He had built a prison around us and dressed it up as devotion. I moved back to my bedroom slowly, my pulse beating a new and dangerous rhythm. The paralyzing grief and bewilderment that had gripped me since the clinic burned away, replaced by a cold and absolute clarity. I was no longer a frightened old man watching his wife dissolve into dementia's fog. I was a man who had understood at last that his house was being demolished from within. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at my hands. These hands had erected steel frameworks that rose against the sky. They were strong, precise, and fully capable of tearing apart whatever corrupt structure my son had raised around us. I knew I could not face him head-on. He commanded the financial levers, the medical proxies, the legal position. A direct challenge now would only cause him to cinch the rope tighter, perhaps having us both institutionalized to bury what he'd done. I had to move in the blind spots of his confidence. He believed I was helpless, oblivious entirely at his mercy. He thought I was just another column in his structure, one he could lean on and manipulate at will. I turned toward the bedroom door, jaw set with a resolve I hadn't felt in years. I was going to get into that refrigerator. I was going to test what my gut was already telling me. And I was going to find out precisely what my perfect son had been feeding my wife. I sat motionless in the dark until the red numbers on the nightstand clock blinked over to 2 hours in the morning. The suburban estate in Fairfax County, Virginia, had gone profoundly still, that particular brand of deep pressing silence that only settles over a house in the true dead of night. My heart was driving hard against my ribs. A sensation I hadn't felt since the early days of walking narrow steel beams high above a city skyline. I had spent the preceding 2 hours sitting completely still in the dark, mapping out every step of what I was about to do. From the bottom of my old leather travel bag, I pulled out a small, sterile glass vial I normally used for travel medications. I also retrieved a tiny plastic bottle of dark food coloring from a baking kit Clara used to keep tucked in her craft closet, along with a thin tension wrench and a curved hook pick from a specialized tool set I had carried since my years running major construction sites. Back in those days, managing multi-million-dollar commercial job sites sometimes meant creatively getting past jammed equipment lock boxes when an exhausted foreman had lost the key. I never once imagined those same tools would end up in my hands in the middle of the night, letting me into a refrigerator inside my own home. I slipped out of my bedroom, leaving my hard-soled shoes behind. I moved down the long hallway in my thick wool socks, planting my feet carefully along the outer edges of each floorboard, where the wood sat directly over the structural joists below and would hold firm without complaint. I knew every inch of this house. I had drawn the plans myself. I knew exactly which boards would groan beneath a man's weight and which ones would carry him in complete silence. The staircase felt like it took an eternity. Every shifting shadow in the darkened house seemed to twist and lunge at the edges of my vision, playing on the nerves of tired, aging eyes. I reached the bottom landing and held still, holding my breath, listening for anything. Nothing. Only the faint, distant hum of the central air system cycling on. I moved through the kitchen, clearing the marble island without a sound, and made straight for the secondary medical refrigerator at the back of the walk-in pantry. The small brass padlock hung on the handles, catching a pale sliver of moonlight from the kitchen windows. I lowered myself to one knee on the cold tile floor and drew the penlight from my pocket. I gripped it between my teeth, freeing both trembling hands for the work ahead. I eased the tension wrench into the base of the keyway, holding it with a light, steady pressure from my left thumb. With my right hand, I worked the curved hook pick carefully into the lock. The mechanism was surprisingly basic, a standard brass tumbler that offered almost no real resistance to practiced hands. I felt the first pin bind, then settle with a quiet click. Then the second. Then the third. A moment later, the cylinder turned with a soft, clean give. I caught the padlock in my palm before it could strike the metal door and shatter the silence. I slid it into my trouser pocket and eased the refrigerator open. A breath of cool air moved across my damp face. There on the top wire shelf, sitting completely alone, was the chipped red thermos. I wrapped both hands around it and lifted it free. It felt unnaturally heavy and cold. I turned the metal lid, carefully wincing as that faint, metallic, deeply earthy smell drifted out again into the confined space. Working as fast as my old hands could manage, I uncapped the sterile glass vial. I tipped roughly 2 fl.Oz of the thick, murky liquid into the small tube, sealed it tightly so it wouldn't leak, and pressed it deep into my pocket. Then I carried the red thermos to the kitchen sink. I emptied the remaining contents straight down the drain and watched the dark liquid swirl away into the pipes. I rinsed the container thoroughly under cold tap water until no residue clung to the stainless steel walls. I refilled it with fresh filtered water, then added 3 precise drops of the dark food coloring I'd carried down from upstairs. I swirled it until the color and opacity matched Garrett's supposed holistic blend, close enough to pass. I screwed the lid back down, wiped the outside dry with a dish towel, and crept back into the dark pantry to return the thermos to the exact spot where I had found it. I was reaching into my pocket for the brass padlock when my blood went cold. A sharp, distinct creak cut through the silence from the top of the wooden stairs. Footsteps. Someone in the house was awake. The soft pad of bare feet grew louder, advancing down the upper hallway toward the stairs. Panic ripped through my chest like a current. I had seconds before I was discovered. I looped the padlock back through the refrigerator handles and drove the shackle down hard until it snapped shut with a sound that seemed to fill the entire room. The footsteps were already halfway down the stairs. I looked wildly around the moonlit kitchen. There was no time to reach the living room or slip down the hall unseen. I threw myself back into the walk-in pantry, hauling the slatted wooden door nearly shut and leaving just a sliver of space to see through. I pressed my spine against the cool shelving, tucking myself behind a row of tall cereal boxes and canned goods. I clamped my hand hard over my mouth to smother my own ragged breathing. Through the narrow gap in the door, the kitchen lights came on and flooded the room in hard, unforgiving brightness. Nadine walked directly into my line of sight. She wore a long cashmere robe, her sharp features thrown into relief by the overhead glare. She moved to the kitchen island, opened a cabinet for a glass, and carried it to the sink to fill it at the tap. For one agonizing moment, she stopped, eyes dropping to the stainless steel basin, staring at the very spot where I had just poured out the thermos contents. I shut my eyes and asked whatever was listening to let me have rinsed it clean. As an engineer, I had built my entire career on calculations, on verified facts, on structural certainty. Luck had never been part of my methodology. But right now, in this suffocating darkness, luck was the only load-bearing element keeping everything from collapsing. The silence pressed down heavy with secrets and with threat. I could feel the cool glass of the vial hard against my thigh, a tiny container holding a truth that could detonate everything. I thought of Clara lying helpless in the bedroom above us, unaware that our own son had built a chemical prison around her. The scale of the betrayal rose up inside me like a wave of nausea. I had to hold myself together. I had to stay perfectly still. I drew a slow, shaky breath to keep my nerves from unraveling. My heart was slamming against my ribs so hard I was sure she could feel it from across the room. I kept my hand wrapped around the vial in my pocket, gripping it like the only solid thing left in my world. Nadine stood there for what stretched into what felt like an eternity, sipping her water. Slowly, eyes drifting over the dark corners of the kitchen, she took one deliberate step toward the pantry door. Every muscle in my body locked. If she opened that door, it was finished. My one advantage, the element of surprise, would be gone, and Garrett would know I was watching him. But then she stopped. She set her glass on the marble counter, switched off the kitchen lights, and walked away. I tracked the sound of her footsteps climbing the stairs until they dissolved into the silence of the upper floor. I slid down the pantry wall and sat on the cold tile, clutching the vial. I had the sample. Now I needed the truth. Morning light bled through the bedroom curtains, throwing long, sharp shadows across the hardwood floor. I sat in my armchair, a cup of black coffee cooling between my palms, waiting for the daily ritual to begin. At exactly 9 Sauternes, the heavy oak door swung open. Garrett entered in a tailored charcoal suit, carrying himself with the easy confidence of a man who believes he owns the room. In his right hand, the red stainless steel thermos. I watched him cross to Clara's bedside, my heart keeping a slow, agonizing count against my ribs. I buried every gram of my fury beneath a mask of worn-out gratitude and offered him the weak, tired smile of a broken 70-year-old man leaning on his rescuer. Garrett returned it with a look of deep, practiced pity. He perched on the edge of the mattress, unscrewed the lid, and poured the dark liquid into a small feeding cup. It was nothing more than filtered water tinted with food coloring, but to Garrett, it was his instrument of complete control. I held my breath as he raised the cup to Clara's lips. She swallowed without looking at him, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Garrett dabbed her chin with a tissue, his expression radiating a quiet, self-satisfied ease. He had no idea his carefully engineered system had already been breached. He squeezed my shoulder, mentioned a board meeting in the city, and walked out of the room. I listened to his footsteps trail down the hallway and the distant thud of the front door. The trap was set. For the rest of that day, I watched my wife with the focused intensity of an engineer running a stress test on a critical support beam. I sent the afternoon caregiver home early, telling her I wanted some quiet time alone with Clara. I pulled my chair up close to the bed and tracked every breath, every faint twitch of muscle. For the first several hours, nothing changed. The thick fog of the past 7 years seemed firmly in place. She lay still and silent, staring at the wall. Doubt started working at the edges of my mind. What if I had it wrong? What if this truly was an irreversible neurological decline? Nothing more. But as the late afternoon light dropped below the horizon and the room filled with a dim orange glow, I caught the first hairline crack in the facade. The violent tremors that usually seized her hands in the hour before dinner were completely absent. Her fingers lay still against the white cotton sheets. Her breathing, normally shallow and irregular, had settled into something deeper and more natural. The locked tension in her jaw gradually eased. I sat rigid in my chair, afraid even to shift my weight, terrified to disturb whatever fragile process was at work inside her. The chemical chains were beginning to let go. I stayed at her side long after dark, refusing food, refusing to glance away even for a moment. The house settled into its deep nighttime quiet. But inside me, everything was howling. Hope and terror wound so tightly together, I couldn't separate them. I was waiting for a woman I thought I had lost forever to find her way back to me. The hours crawled. Midnight came and went, then 1 in the morning, then 2. My eyes ached with exhaustion, but I would not let them close. The digital clock on the nightstand threw a hard red glow across the darkened room. It was exactly 4:00 in the morning when the unthinkable happened. The room's quiet rhythm was broken by a sudden sharp gasp. I lurched upright in the chair, my heart slamming into my throat. Clara shifted violently beneath the heavy blankets. The labored, mechanical stillness of the past 7 years simply vanished. She flung the covers off her chest in a frantic, uncoordinated surge of motion. I lurched forward and dropped to my knees right beside the bed, my hands hovering over her trembling shoulders. Clara turned her head toward me slowly. The pale moonlight coming through the window caught her face, and I stopped breathing entirely. The thick, impenetrable fog that had glazed her eyes for 7 agonizing years was completely gone. Her gaze was clear, sharp, and intensely focused. But it held none of the warm, loving recognition I had spent thousands of sleepless nights praying to see. Her eyes were wide pupils blown open, flooded with a raw, primal, absolute terror. It was an expression of pure horror, the look of someone who had jolted awake to find themselves trapped inside a burning building. Roland. She breathed it out. My name. She actually said my name. It came out raspy and fragile, her voice severely eroded by years of total silence, but it was unmistakably hers. The shock hit me like a physical blow. I felt genuinely lightheaded. I reached out to gently touch her face, to tell her she was safe, to tell her I was right there beside her. But before my fingers could even graze her cheek, she surged forward. Her frail, bony hands shot out of the darkness and seized the collar of my shirt. The sheer, desperate force of her grip was terrifying. She hauled me down toward her face, her chest heaving in rapid, panicked bursts. Her eyes swept wildly around the darkened room, raking the shadows, as if expecting something to lunge from the corners. Then she looked back at me, her expression contorted in absolute agony. Her lips shook violently as she fought to make her vocal cords obey. I leaned in my ear, hovering inches from her mouth, utterly paralyzed by the weight of the moment. Her grip on my collar tightened, knuckles draining white. Key. She gasped it out. One single ragged word forced up from somewhere deep, wrung out with every last reserve she had. Key! Before I could ask what she meant, before I could beg her to keep going, a violent spasm tore through her entire body. A massive, crushing migraine struck her visibly. She let out a sharp, agonized cry, her hands releasing my shirt, to claw desperately at both sides of her head. Her back arched hard against the mattress, her eyes rolling upward as the overwhelming pain short-circuited her recovering brain. And then, as suddenly as she had come back to me, she collapsed against the pillows, dropping instantly into a deep, heavy unconsciousness. I was left kneeling on the hard wooden floor, completely alone in the freezing dark, my hands shaking violently. The room closed back in with a suffocating, terrifying silence. Key. The word echoed without mercy inside my shattered mind. My wife was locked inside a chemical prison, and I had just intercepted the first agonizing transmission from the abyss. I knew in that instant, with a cold and absolute certainty, that I would tear my treacherous son apart, piece by piece, until I found the exact hidden lock that word belonged to. The pale morning light filtered through the heavy curtains, carrying with it a profound sense of impending destruction. I had not slept a single second since Clara lost consciousness in my arms. I sat in the armchair perfectly still, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. She had not spoken again. The heavy, chemical-induced slumber had reclaimed her, pulling her back down into that dark abyss. But the single word she had gasped into the night was burned permanently into me. Key. I turned it over and over in my mind like a jagged stone. Then, at exactly 8:00 in the morning, the heavy front door swung open. The sharp, rapid click of expensive heels on hardwood reached me before anything else. It was Nadine. She almost never came this early and never unannounced. I quickly wiped my face and rubbed my eyes, manufacturing the look of an exhausted, helpless old man, then walked out into the hallway to intercept her. Nadine was standing in the entryway holding a pristine white bakery box. "Good morning, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with that practiced sugary sweetness. "I brought some fresh blueberry muffins from the patisserie downtown. I thought you could use a little pick-me-up after yesterday." I offered her a weak, trembling smile and accepted the box with a shaky hand. "You are too kind, Nadine," I murmured. "I am just so incredibly tired today." I left her in the kitchen and drifted back toward the master bedroom, leaving the door open just a crack. Nadine followed a few minutes later, carrying 2 cups of hot black coffee. She stepped into the room, her eyes snapping immediately to Clara, who was propped up against the pillows. Clara was still, but the deathly absolute rigidity was gone. Her hands rested softly in her lap, and her chest moved with a natural, steady rhythm. Nadine walked to the bed and set the coffee down on the nightstand. "Good morning, Mom," she sang out, bending slightly toward her. Clara did not speak, but her head turned slow and deliberate. Her eyes found Nadine and locked on. The vacant, empty stare was nowhere in it. Instead, a flicker of pure, unmistakable awareness moved across my wife's face. Her brow furrowed. A tiny, almost imperceptible sound escaped her throat, not a word, just a soft vocalization of recognition and fear. The reaction was instantaneous. Nadine recoiled as if she had been physically struck. That polished, dutiful daughter-in-law performance shattered in a fraction of a second. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a sickening gray. She stared at Clara, her breath catching audibly in her throat. "Dad." Nadine stammered, her voice completely stripped of its usual melodic warmth. "Has she been like this all morning? Has she moved at all?" I played my part without a single misstep. I shuffled slowly forward, my face arranged in an expression of gentle confusion. "Like what, Nadine?" I asked, letting my voice waver. "She seems a little more peaceful today, don't you think?" Perhaps the new doctor was right to adjust our expectations. Nadine did not answer. She practically sprinted out of the bedroom, her heels cracking hard and fast down the hallway. I followed at a silent distance, keeping to the shadows of the corridor. I watched her tear into the kitchen and head straight for the walk-in pantry. She stared at the locked secondary refrigerator, grabbed the handle and yanked it firmly to confirm the heavy brass padlock was still holding. Then she ripped her phone from her designer handbag. Her thumbs flew across the lit screen with frantic, desperate speed. Her whole body was vibrating with raw panic. She paced back and forth in front of the large marble island, biting her thumbnail, waiting for a response. The trap had been sprung at last, and the rats were only just beginning to scramble. Within 3 short hours, the front door burst open again. Garrett marched into the house, his face a mask of cold, calculated rage dressed up as extreme medical concern. He had abandoned his usual pristine business suit for dark jeans and a wrinkled dress shirt. He looked completely unhinged. Nadine was right behind him, wringing her hands together in a theatrical display of profound anxiety. Garrett stormed directly into the living room, a thick, heavy manila folder clamped tightly under his arm. "Dad, sit down." He ordered, his voice completely stripped of its usual patronizing warmth. It was the flat, commanding tone of an executive issuing a non-negotiable directive. I lowered myself slowly onto the edge of the sofa, letting my hands tremble visibly in my lap. "What is wrong, Garrett?" I asked, forcing my voice to crack with manufactured fear. "Why are you both so upset? Is it your mother?" Garrett slapped the thick folder down onto the glass coffee table. He dropped to one knee in front of me and placed his hands firmly on my knees. "Dad, you need to listen to me very carefully." He began, his eyes fixed on mine with a terrifying, predatory intensity. "Nadine called me this morning. She told me Mom was displaying unusual motor function and increased lucidity. I know you think this is a good thing, Dad. I know you want your wife back. But you do not understand what is actually happening." He paused and let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. "I spoke to Dr. Crane and our specialists in Zurich immediately. This is not a recovery, Dad. It is a dangerous terminal neurological spike. Her damaged neural pathways are misfiring violently. The sudden lucidity is a symptom of a massive, impending, catastrophic seizure. The holistic blend is no longer sufficient to suppress it. We have to move her tonight." I stared at him, letting my mouth hang slightly open in feigned absolute horror. "Move her where?" I whispered, clutching the fabric of my trousers. "A room is ready and waiting at a highly specialized closed-ward psychiatric facility in Western Virginia near Staunton." Garrett fired it off without a flicker of hesitation. "The staff there have the physical restraints and the chemical suppressants necessary to stop her from tearing her own mind apart. A transport unit arrives at 8:00 tonight. There is no other path, Dad. You need to trust me on this." He slid the thick manila folder across the glass table and planted a silver pen on top of it. "All I need are your signatures on these transfer authorizations," he said, rapping the pen against the cover. "It hands me the medical proxy to manage the move and approve whatever heavy sedation the team requires during transport. Back page, Dad, clock is running." I set his tone aside and peeled the folder open. The first 3 pages looked like routine medical transfer paperwork. Then I reached page 4, and every drop of warmth left my body. Tucked inside an emergency proxy clause, practically camouflaged in dense legal language, was a provision for the permanent transfer of asset management. They wanted my wife removed, and they wanted my fortune along with her. I kept my eyes on that page. Permanent transfer of asset management. The phrase seemed to throb on the paper as the full architecture of what my son had built finally came into focus. This was never just about hiding Clara's recovery behind locked psychiatric doors. This was a coordinated seizure of every asset I had left. Garrett had dressed a theft in a white coat. A manufactured medical crisis designed to bully me into surrendering my financial autonomy, my home, my last remaining leverage. If I ripped that mask off him right here, accused him to his face of poisoning his own mother, I would walk away with nothing. He commanded the proxy, the clinical paperwork, and the physical advantage over a man 30 years his senior. I was 70 years old, alone in my own living room, cornered by a predator who wore my last name. I could not move yet. What I needed was breathing room, enough space to detonate the trap I'd already armed with the glass vial pressed cold against my thigh. I exhaled slowly, a long, deliberate release. Then I let the folder slide out of my grip. It landed across the glass tabletop with a hollow, beaten sound. I pitched forward and buried my face in both hands. I willed my shoulders into a convincing shudder. I reached into the deepest part of myself, the real anguish I carried for Clara, and used it as fuel. When I raised my face again, the grief was genuine enough to flood my eyes. A ragged, wretched sob tore out of me. "Garrett!" The word barely made it past my lips. "Not tonight. You cannot come in here and haul her out into the darkness like she is cargo. She is my wife. She has been everything to me for over 40 years. Garrett locked his arms across his chest, jaw tightening, patience evaporating in real time. He threw a look at Nadine. She responded with an eye roll and a sharp, clipped exhale. "Dad, this ground has already been covered." Garrett said flatly, the words heavy with contempt, dressed up as weariness. "This is not optional. It is clinical necessity. Leave her where she is, and she risks a fatal aneurysm. The transport specialists are already confirmed. Emotion is clouding your judgment. You are the one putting her in danger right now." I let my knees give out. I went down onto the Persian rug, both palms flat against the floor. Prostrating myself completely was the most powerful signal I could send, and every bit of it was theater. I looked up at them both, inhabiting every inch of the feeble, oblivious old man they had written me as. 3 days. The plea came out, strangled, pitched high with raw desperation. 3 days, that is all I am asking. Let me be with her in our home. Let me read to her the way I always did. Let me hold her hand in the place where we built our life. If that ambulance comes tonight, Garrett, it will finish me. I mean that." Nadine moved forward, peering down at me with something close to revulsion. "Garrett, we cannot push this back. The deposit on the private suite is already gone. Delay it further and the bed disappears, and she could spiral again before we get another placement. He gets his 3 days. Garrett shut her down with a flat, raised hand. His gaze came back down to me, and behind it lived the unmistakable glow of a man who believed he had already won. He saw rubble, a shattered old man on his knees, offering no further resistance. Every safeguard he had engineered, every angle he had calculated, felt to him like an airtight vault. "I will phone the clinic and hold the placement for exactly 72 hours, Dad." He went on, his voice smoothing back into that polished, reasonable register that turned my stomach. "But every page of those authorizations gets signed right now. I need the legal standing to hold the reservation, and I need the asset proxy executed, so the treatment costs can be released. You give me your signature tonight, and the weekend is yours to say whatever goodbye you need to say. Come Monday morning, that team walks through the door, and you step aside. Are we agreed?" I bobbed my head, scrubbing my face with the back of one shaking hand. "Yes," I breathed. "Yes. Whatever it takes, Garrett. Just leave her with me until Friday." He yanked the folder back across the table and drove it into my chest pen already extended. I wrapped my fingers around the barrel, letting them stumble against the smooth metal the way an old man's hands would. I found the first page. Nadine had pressed little yellow, sticky tabs beside each signature block, with the thoroughness of someone who had rehearsed this moment. I pulled a long, unsteady breath and touched pen to paper. 40 years at the helm of a major commercial construction company had put thousands of high-stakes contracts through my hands. In that industry, raw, competitive, and riddled with opportunists, forged documents, and hostile moves against ownership were not hypothetical. They were scheduled hazards. So my attorneys and I had built a private legal circuit breaker. My binding signature required my middle initial, the letter M, joined to my surname, by one continuous, unbroken stroke. Any version without it was classified by my legal team as a non-binding draft mark void from the moment the ink dried. Garrett had no knowledge of this. He had absorbed the company after I'd already stepped back, and he'd never gone digging through the fine-grained protections I had built around myself over decades. I drew my first name, skipped the initial without a tremor of hesitation, and finished with my last name in a shaky, lurching scrawl, the penmanship of a man signing under duress. I moved through the document, scratching that same hollow signature across the medical proxy. I reached page 4, held the permanent asset transfer clause in my gaze for one still moment, and put that same invalid mark on the line. Every page received the same deliberate omission. Then I surrendered the folder to my son with the hollow eyes of a beaten man. Garrett swiped it up and made a quick circuit through the pages, checking that ink appeared in the correct positions. A slow, cold smile settled across his face. "Thank you, Dad. The right call." He tucked it under his arm. "We will be back Friday morning with the team. Keep yourself out of trouble." From the floor, I watched Garrett and Nadine move through the living room and out. The front door closed hard, and the silence that followed pressed in from every wall. I stayed still, tracking the shrinking sound of their vehicle backing out of the drive. When the last trace of the engine faded into the night, my hands went quiet. My face dried. I rose in a single unhurried motion and squared my shoulders. The performance was finished. The calculating engineer had returned. They had handed me 3 days, and 3 days was more than sufficient to reduce everything they had built against me to wreckage. They were gone. I got up off the rug. 72 hours remained before the transport team came for Clara. I walked back to the master bedroom where my wife lay in the deepest, most natural sleep she had managed in 7 years. Her breathing slow and even. The glass vial sat heavy in my pocket, a small, cold vessel carrying the proof that would take them apart. Dawn arrived gray and cheerless. I had no illusions about Garrett leaving us unsupervised. I had designed this house knowing every angle and sightline by heart, but Garrett had replaced the exterior camera system after folding my company into his own. I had to operate as though I was already being watched. The early hours I gave entirely to the performance. I dragged myself through the kitchen in worn slippers, shoulders caved pouring black coffee with hands that shook on cue. I settled at the island and fixed my gaze on the marble surface, the portrait of a devastated husband, watching his final hours with his wife count down. Around 9:00 in the morning, I moved to the task that would give me my cover: kitchen trash. I worked through it methodically, knotting the heavy plastic bags one by one. My hand found the glass vial in my pocket and closed around it. I transferred it carefully to the inner breast pocket of my wool cardigan and zipped it shut. Then I hoisted the bags and made my slow way toward the back door. Outside, the air had that clean-edged quality that comes before rain. I moved down the paved driveway with my head lowered, every step measured to read as the shuffle of a man with nothing left to hurry for. The security camera above the garage followed me. I could feel it without looking. I kept the cardigan collar up and my chin down. Behind the house, a narrow, overgrown alleyway ran along the rear boundary of the neighborhood estates. When I designed those perimeter walls 40 years ago, I had engineered a deliberate blind spot into the layout, a pocket of dead space tucked directly behind the massive ancient oak that anchored the far corner of the lot. The angle of the tall brick retaining wall and the dense canopy above it conspired to produce a well of shadow that no lens could reach. I got to the garbage bins ranked against the brick wall, threw the lids back and dropped the bags in. The hollow thud echoed down the alley. I paused, breathed once, then stepped back 3 quick paces into the darkness behind that old oak. The alley was still tangled, ivy-forgotten debris, no movement. Then, a figure peeled away from the brick wall and came forward rolling an unlit toothpick between his teeth. Howie Dunbar was 72 years old, but the years had done nothing to diminish the broad, imposing frame he'd carried through 4 decades as a private investigator. We called him Dunk. We'd come up together in the same hard-edged neighborhoods, scrapping through the same fights. When I was stacking commercial high-rises above the Dallas skyline, Dunk was the man I called when a subcontractor's references didn't hold up, or a city inspector started asking for the wrong kind of favors. Oldest friend I had, a man built entirely from loyalty and grit. "You look like pure hell, Roland," Dunk said, his voice the sound of gravel shifting under pressure. He stayed back in the shadows, keeping his wide shoulders away from any angle a camera might catch. He wore a worn canvas jacket and a dark, flat cap pulled down to his eyebrows. "I feel it, Dunk," I said, barely above a breath, equal parts relief and dread moving through me. "I'm grateful you came on short notice. I know there wasn't much to go on when I rang you from the burner this morning. You said life or death." He shifted the toothpick to the other side of his mouth. 40 years, and you have never said that to me. So walk me through it. What are we standing in?" Garrett finally stepped across a line he cannot purchase his way back from. I reached into the inner pocket of my cardigan and drew out the sterile glass vial. My fingers weren't entirely steady. The dark, murky liquid moved sluggishly against the glass as I extended it into the shadow between us. Dunk reached out and closed his large, calloused hand around it. He held it up and studied the fluid with narrowed eyes. "Garrett has been feeding this to Clara every single day for the past 7 years. I said, keeping my voice level against the fury turning over in my chest like a machine. He told me it was an expensive, imported Swiss botanical blend, something to manage her neurological tremors. Then 2 days ago, a new doctor reviewed her blood work and practically begged me to keep my wife away from our son. I lifted this sample directly from his padlocked refrigerator in the middle of the night." Dunk lowered the vial. His eyes came up to mine, and all the casual ease was gone. In its place was the cold, precise operative I had leaned on for decades. "You think he is actively poisoning her?" he said, his raspy voice dropping to something quiet and lethal. "You think your own son has been holding her inside a chemical coma?" "I don't just think it, Dunk. I know it," I said. No waver. "She surfaced last night. The fog broke just for a few minutes. She looked straight at me and her eyes were full of terror. Now he is moving her to a closed psychiatric ward this Friday to bury what he has done, and he is using the transfer paperwork to strip away every dollar of wealth I have left. I handed him a forged signature on the asset documents to buy myself 72 hours. Dunk let out a low, dark whistle and tucked the vial deep inside the worn canvas jacket. "Forged signature. The old invalid variant, same move you ran on that downtown plaza contract back in the day. You always were a clever bastard, Roland, but 72 hours is not much runway for tearing down a fortress. That is exactly why I came to you. I need a full toxicology screen run on that liquid. No local diagnostics facilities. Garrett sits on half the medical charity boards in this city. My name walks into a standard lab, and his people will intercept the sample before it reaches a single instrument." Dunk gave one slow, grim nod and began pulling back into the shadows. "I will get you the truth, Roland." A low whisper. Then the darkness took him completely. I watched him dissolve into the heavy morning fog before turning back toward the house. My hands were empty. My mind was not. I had 72 hours to dismantle the structure my son had raised around my family piece by piece. The first priority was irrefutable evidence of what was happening inside these walls, something a toxicology report alone could not deliver. A chemical analysis would confirm what was in the vial, but I needed to see how Garrett and Nadine actually moved through this house when they believed no one was watching. I needed eyes in the dark. That morning, I told Nadine I had to get to the pharmacy for my blood pressure medication. She offered to drive, all performed concern and careful smiles, but I dug in and refused, playing the stubborn old man, still clawing at whatever scraps of independence he had left. She let it go, happy enough to have the house to herself, to finalize the psychiatric transport arrangements. I drove directly to a specialized electronics and surveillance equipment retailer in Sterling, Virginia. I walked past the consumer security aisles without slowing and asked for the store manager by name, a man who had quietly supplied discreet surveillance hardware to my construction firm years before. I walked out with 4 military-grade micro cameras. The devices were remarkable, smaller than a dime, with ultra-high-definition optics, thermal night vision capability, and encrypted wireless transmitters that would push a live feed straight to my tablet. I was back at the house just after noon. The rooms were quiet. Nadine was somewhere upstairs, deep in a business call, and Garrett was at his corporate office across the city. The window was narrow, and I knew it. I went to the basement workbench and laid out my tools. For 40 years, I had traced structural load paths, designed complex electrical systems, and built the hidden infrastructure of massive commercial projects. Concealing 4 miniature cameras inside household fixtures was barely a warm-up for a man trained at that level. I had already removed the hardwired smoke detectors from the ceilings. Now I worked each tiny camera module into the slotted plastic venting of a detector housing and wired it cleanly into the home's continuous electrical current. No batteries to drain, no gaps in coverage, permanent, invisible, and entirely unsuspected. I moved from room to room with the quiet, unhurried focus of a man who had done precision work in tight spaces his entire life. The first modified detector went directly above the marble island in the kitchen, pointed squarely at the secondary medical refrigerator. The second I mounted in my old home office, the room Garrett had long since claimed as his own private base of operations for managing his hedge fund. Then I came to the master bedroom. Clara was resting quietly. I positioned a stepping stool near the center of the ceiling and fitted the third detector into place, angling the microscopic lens to take in the full sweep of her bed and the floor surrounding it. Every speck of dust was cleaned away. My tools went back to the basement. I withdrew to the guest bedroom. What I'm about to tell you is the part that changed everything, not just for me, but for everyone inside that house. The weight of what I had quietly uncovered was about to come to a head. So let me ask you this: if you discovered that someone close to you had been working against you in the dark, would you confront them the moment you found out, or would you wait, gather every last piece of proof, and let them walk straight into their own trap? I locked the door and woke the tablet, the encrypted monitoring software loading up and splitting the display into 4 crisp, high-definition quadrants. The audio pickups were extraordinarily sensitive. I spent what remained of the afternoon and evening rooted in that chair, eyes fixed on the glowing screen. I watched Nadine wear a path in the kitchen tile, phone pressed to her ear, griping about the logistical headaches of moving Clara to the closed ward. I watched Garrett come back from the city, posture stiff with that particular brand of arrogance he'd worn so long it had become his resting state, and pour himself a glass of expensive bourbon in my office. They moved through my house, completely blind to the net I had quietly dropped over them. Night closed in. The big suburban rooms went dark. The micro cameras flipped automatically into thermal night vision, painting every surface in luminous shades of green and white. I sat in absolute blackness, the tablet screen carving pale light across my face. Midnight came and the house went still. The hours stacked up. I refused to let my eyes close. Adrenaline and a rage that had nowhere to go were more than enough to keep me upright. I was waiting for the moment one of their masks would slip. At exactly 2:00 in the morning, movement bloomed in the upper left quadrant. The hallway feed caught two glowing thermal shapes moving without a sound toward the master bedroom. Garrett and Nadine. My heart drove itself against my ribs as I tapped the screen and expanded the feed from Clara's room. The heavy door swung inward, and they stepped inside. Night vision turned the space an eerie spectral green. Clara lay utterly still on the bed. Garrett positioned himself near the foot of the mattress. Hands settled on his hips, gazing down at his mother with the flat, incurious expression of someone looking at furniture. Nadine drifted toward the nightstand and began checking the arrangement of monitors and pill bottles. The microphone caught even the faint drag of fabric against fabric. Then Nadine spoke. It came out as a harsh, venomous hiss, nothing left of the saccharine warmth she packaged herself in by daylight. "The old man is getting suspicious," she said, eyes cutting across the bed toward her husband. "He was asking too many questions in the car yesterday, and that whole scene he made in the living room today, begging for 3 more days. He is buying time, I know it. He is a pathetic fool, but he is not entirely stupid." Garrett made a quiet, dismissive sound and dragged a hand through his hair. "Let him be suspicious, Nadine. He signed the asset transfer authorizations. The legal proxies are in our hands. In 72 hours, she will be locked away in the psychiatric facility, completely out of reach, and his entire estate will sit permanently under our control. Whatever he suspects at this point is irrelevant. He has no leverage left." Nadine bent down close to Clara, her face hovering just above my helpless wife. I gripped the tab and watched in silent, sickened horror as Nadine reached into the deep pocket of her long cashmere robe and produced a small, unlabeled plastic bottle filled with pills. "We cannot afford any risk right now," she hissed, her voice threaded through with a dark and urgent malice. "Did you see her eyes this morning? The blend is losing its effect. Triple the dose tonight. She cannot be allowed to remember the original will." The blood in my veins went cold. My hands locked around the tablet knuckles, blanching white. The original will. My mind snapped back to 7 years earlier. Before her devastating fall, Clara and I had sat down with our estate attorneys and drafted a specific airtight joint will. We had built it so that if either of us died or became medically incapacitated, the whole of our wealth would vault clean over Garrett and land inside unbreakable trusts beyond the reach of his appetites entirely. We knew he had neither the discipline nor the character to steward what I had built. Clara was named primary executor. If she recovered her cognitive function, if she remembered the legal protections she had helped design, Garrett would lose his grip on my multi-million-dollar company. His hedge fund capital, his fabricated kingdom, all of it would dissolve. The so-called tragic accident that started all of this suddenly refracted into something far more sinister. Did she simply fall, or was she deliberately pushed? On the screen, Garrett nodded slowly and took the pill bottle from his wife's hand. He ground on 3 pale tablets against the nightstand, using the bottom of a water glass, swept the fine white powder into Clara's feeding cup, added tap water, and pressed it to her lips, gently working her throat to make certain every drop went down. They stayed in the room a few minutes longer, murmuring reassurances to each other about the transport arrangements, utterly unaware that I had captured every second of it. When the lights went off and they left her to sink back into that manufactured stupor, I let myself fall against the chair. I sat in the darkness of the guest bedroom and felt the cold move through me like something structural had failed. The scale of what they had done was staggering, but I still needed the chemical evidence to close the circle. I needed to know the exact weapon they had been using against her mind. The hours before dawn were long and airless. At exactly 6:15, The prepaid burner phone tucked inside my travel bag began vibrating against the hardwood. A hard, insistent buzz that ripped through the silence. I grabbed it and pressed it to my ear without making a sound. I just listened. Waited. Roland Dunk's voice came through gravel and weight, older sounding somehow than it had been 24 hours ago, freighted with something grim. I got the lab results back from my private contact. You need to be sitting down for this, my friend. I am already sitting, Dunk, I said, voice hollow. Tell me what is in that vial. All of it. No softening. I heard paper move. Then a long, furious exhale. I have seen a lot of ugly things across 4 decades of this work. Roland Dunk began his tone stripped of everything except undisguised contempt. But what I am looking at right now is a special category of concentrated, deliberate evil. That liquid you handed me contains absolutely 0 botanicals. No Swiss herbal extracts, no holistic adaptogens of any kind. What it contains is tap water, dark food coloring, and a heavily concentrated, fully illegal chemical cocktail. My grip on the phone tightened until I heard the casing give a faint crack. What kind of cocktail, Dunk? I said, my chest compressing around the words. A massive unlawful dose of haloperidol, he read from the lab report, laying the clinical name down with cold precision. It is a severe first-generation antipsychotic, the kind typically reserved for the most extreme cases of violent schizophrenia in locked institutional wards. But that is not the bottom of it, Roland. The haloperidol has been deliberately cut with trace amounts of heavy metals, lead and mercury derivatives. It is a slow, methodical poison. Taken daily, this exact combination suppresses the central nervous system completely. It shuts down synaptic transmission, produces severe chronic motor tremors, and drives the brain's higher cognitive functions into a deep, inescapable chemical coma. I stopped breathing. The room seemed to lose oxygen all at once. My brilliant, vibrant Clara. The woman who could run complex structural load calculations in her head without a pencil. The woman who spent her weekends painting watercolor landscapes at the kitchen table. She never had rapid-onset dementia. She had not suffered irreversible neurological damage from a fall down our oak staircase. She had been chemically lobotomized. Garrett was not managing a tragic illness. He was the one causing it. He had held his own mother locked inside a chemically induced vegetative state for 7 agonizing years, manufacturing every symptom of late-stage Alzheimer's disease from a bottle. He needed her legally incapacitated to keep his hands on my construction empire. And he needed me buried in grief and caretaking, so I would never look too carefully at the company ledgers. The full weight of the last 7 years came down on me like a collapsing structure, all that tonnage arriving at once. Every day Garrett had walked through my front door in a tailored suit with a composed and dutiful expression. He had squeezed my shoulder and offered hollow comfort and watched me grieve. Then he had walked into her bedroom and given her the dose. He had done all of it for control. "I thank you, Dunk," I said into the phone. "Send the encrypted digital file to the secure server address I gave you, and keep a hard copy locked in your safe. I will guard it with my life, Roland." Dunk said, his voice going firm and deliberate. "Give the bastard exactly what he deserves." The line cut off with a sharp click. I set the phone down on the nightstand. I got to my feet, crossed to the window, and looked out over the sprawling lawns of my estate. The sun was just beginning to clear the horizon, throwing a bright, cruelly cheerful light across the neighborhood. A sudden, violent pressure built in the center of my chest. The walls seemed to lean inward, the room losing its edges. I went down on my knees against the thick carpet and pressed my forehead to the cold glass. And then everything I had been holding broke open at once. Silent, agonizing tears. My shoulders convulsed as waves of grief tore through my aging frame without making a sound. I wept for the 7 years of living that had been ripped away from my wife. I wept for the thousands of hours she had spent sealed inside her own mind, aware and terrified in the dark, while her own son pressed poison to her lips. I wept for the failure of my own fatherhood, for having raised something so empty of human feeling that it could torture the woman who had given it life. But even as the tears ran down my face, the core of my engineer's mind was already doing something else. It was cooling, hardening. The grief was necessary, a final purging of the trusting, oblivious father I had been. By the time I stood back up from that floor, my eyes were dry. The sorrow was gone, and in its place sat something cold, absolute, and entirely without mercy. I knew how controlled demolitions worked. I had ordered dozens of them, and I was going to bring Garrett's entire stolen empire down precisely on top of him. The morning light had barely cleared the rooftops, throwing long, pale shadows across the manicured grounds. I stayed by the window a few more minutes and let the cold truth of my new reality anchor itself in my bones. My wife had been systematically poisoned inside our own home by the son we had built a life for. I left the guest bedroom and moved into the hallway. At the top of the grand oak staircase, I stopped. I stood without moving and looked down at the polished wooden steps. 7 years ago, I had found Clara crumpled at the bottom of this exact staircase, twisted, broken, motionless. Garrett had been the one to call the ambulance. He told the paramedics she must have caught her foot on the loose edge of the Persian runner rug. For years, I had blamed myself, hollowed out by guilt over a piece of fabric I had failed to secure properly. The guilt had eaten me from the inside out. Now I looked at those steps and saw something else entirely. The story I had been told was changing shape beneath my feet, darkening into something far more deliberate. Before the full weight of that could settle on me, the burner phone in my pocket buzzed again. I expected Dunk calling back with additional toxicological detail. The screen showed an unknown encrypted number instead. I put the phone to my ear and said nothing. "Mr. Everett," a quiet, taut voice came through. It was Dr. Crane, the sharp young neurologist who had reviewed Clara's blood work 2 days earlier and pressed me to investigate her sudden decline. "I am calling from a secure, untraceable line." He continued, his voice wound tight with barely contained alarm. "Are you somewhere completely private?" "Yes, Dr. Crane," I said, stepping back into the guest bedroom and turning the lock. "I am alone. Tell me what you found." I heard the crinkle of papers through the receiver. "After you left my office, I could not set your wife's case aside," Dr. Crane said, dropping to a low, urgent whisper. The heavy metal toxicity in her initial blood screening made no medical sense for an ordinary neurodegenerative condition. It would not leave me alone. I also knew that her primary physician was a close personal friend of your son, which meant the active medical records were almost certainly compromised. So last night I bypassed the current digital files altogether. I used my administrative clearance to physically access the deep storage hospital archives, going all the way back to the very beginning. I pulled the original admission files and the raw, unedited radiological scans from the day she was brought into the emergency room 7 years ago. I gripped the edge of the wooden desk and stopped breathing. "What did those original scans show?" I asked, forcing my voice to hold. Dr. Crane exhaled slowly, the breath unsteady. "When a patient sustains a severe fall down a flight of stairs, the resulting trauma presents in a very particular pattern." He explained, choosing each word carefully. "We see random contusions, varied fractures along the extremities, and impact damage consistent with tumbling against multiple angled surfaces. Your wife did sustain injuries of exactly that kind. However, the initial point of impact, the primary trauma that caused the brain swelling and put her into the coma, did not originate from striking the wooden steps or the floor at the bottom. I isolated the high-resolution cranial scans taken within the first hour of her admission. There is a distinct localized fracture at the upper base of her skull, a concentrated point of blunt force trauma. I closed my eyes. A wave of nausea moved through me like a structural failure, slow and total. "Speak plainly, doctor," I said, and my voice had gone to steel. "Tell me exactly what you are saying." The fracture pattern on the back of her skull is consistent with a direct, heavy strike delivered by a solid, cylindrical object. Dr. Crane said, each word landing like something physical against my chest. It occurred mere seconds before the tumbling injuries were sustained. Mr. Everett, your wife did not slip on a loose rug. The physical evidence is entirely unambiguous. She was struck violently from behind, and then she was pushed down that staircase. The silence that followed was deafening. Every fragment of the 7-year puzzle drove itself into place at once, assembling a picture of pure, calculated evil. Garrett had not simply seized an opportunity handed to him by a tragic accident. He had engineered the entire event from the beginning. He had tried to kill his own mother. When the blow and the fall failed to finish her, leaving her instead in a vulnerable, comatose state, he had simply adapted. He had stepped into the role of the devoted, grieving son, secured her medical proxy, and brought her home under his control. He had used his connections to install compliant physicians, locking her inside a chemical prison, to guarantee she could never surface and speak against him. He had paralyzed her with antipsychotics and heavy metals because a dead woman cannot sign over an estate, but a medically incapacitated one can be managed indefinitely. The sheer scale of his sociopathy was beyond anything I had ever allowed myself to imagine. He had embraced me and watched me weep for my wife, knowing every single day that he was the one who had fractured her skull and sent her into that abyss. "I owe you more than I can express for your courage, Dr. Crane," I said into the phone, my voice stripped of anything resembling warmth. "You have put your entire medical career on the line to bring me this truth. I will make certain you are protected when the consequences arrive. Keep those original archived files completely secure, do not digitize them, and do not speak of this to another person. I will reach out when it is time to act." I ended the call and placed the burner phone on the polished wooden desk. I stood alone in the still guest bedroom, drawing cold, quiet air into my lungs. The suffocating grief that had pressed down on me for 7 years was gone, burned away entirely. In its place was something vast and consuming, a fire that had no interest in warmth, only in reducing what remained to rubble. My son was not a misguided opportunist who had exploited a family tragedy. He was a calculating, remorseless predator who had attempted to murder the woman who bore him purely to feed an appetite that could never be satisfied. He had stolen her voice, her mind, and every year she should have lived freely, warehousing her inside a waking nightmare while he moved through the city, spending the wealth I had built with my own hands. I turned back to the window and looked out at the long driveway where the transport ambulance was due in fewer than 3 days. Garrett believed he held every advantage. He was certain I was a beaten, oblivious old man with nothing left to do but wait to disappear. He had no idea that the empire he had stolen was already collapsing silently and completely from the inside out. I stood in that room and let Dr. Crane's revelations settle into the marrow of my bones. My wife had been assaulted, thrown down a staircase, and chemically imprisoned by our own son. The crushing weight of that reality pressed in from every side, but the white-hot fire of vengeance kept my mind honed to a razor's edge. As I stared at the locked bedroom door, a single word began to pulse through my thoughts with relentless force. Key. It was the only word Clara had managed to force through her chemically ravaged vocal cords during that brief window of clarity. In the anguished panic of that night, I'd assumed it was a broken plea, a desperate appeal to lock the door and keep her monstrous son away. But Clara was a brilliant, deeply methodical woman. She had an analytical mind sharp enough to hold its own against any forensic accountant. She didn't squander energy on vague appeals. She was issuing a precise, critical directive. She was pointing me exactly toward where I needed to look. My eyes drifted to the heavy oak wardrobe sitting in the corner. When Garrett had forcibly moved me into this guest suite, he'd casually told the movers to bundle my belongings together with a handful of Clara's oldest, seemingly worthless personal items, things he'd deemed unfit for the pristine master bedroom. Among those cast-off possessions was her thick navy blue winter coat. I crossed to the wardrobe and lifted the heavy woolen garment from its wooden hanger. I ran trembling fingers along the dark fabric, feeling the familiar texture she'd worn on our evening walks through the snow-dusted neighborhood. I worked my hands down to the deep interior lining of the left pocket. I pressed my thumb against the thick seam at the very bottom, searching for the tiny, nearly imperceptible tear she'd deliberately made decades ago. My breath caught as I felt a small, hard, metallic object resting deep inside the hidden fold. I carefully pinched the fabric and coaxed the object upward through the torn lining until it dropped into my waiting palm. A small, intricately carved brass key. I closed my fist tightly around the cold brass, my heart, hammering an uneven, furious rhythm against my ribs. I knew precisely which lock that key belonged to. I waited patiently until late afternoon, monitoring the live surveillance feeds on my encrypted tablet. The screens confirmed that Garrett was still firmly planted at his corporate headquarters in the city, and Nadine had driven off to some luxury spa for a lavish, deeply undeserved afternoon of indulgence. The vast house stood completely empty, wrapped in a heavy, oppressive silence. I slipped out of the guest bedroom and moved quietly down the long, carpeted hallway toward my old home office, the room where I had spent countless nights, constructing my commercial construction empire. A room Garrett had arrogantly seized to run his aggressive, heavily leveraged hedge fund. I stepped inside the sprawling space, ignoring the pretentious modern art and the imported leather furniture he'd brought in to erase every trace of me. My attention was locked entirely on the massive floor-to-ceiling oak bookshelf spanning the far wall. When I originally designed and built this estate 40 years ago, I had engineered a highly secure, deeply hidden compartment directly into the home's foundational structure. It was a structural secret known solely to me and Clara. I moved to the far right section of that towering bookshelf. I dropped to my knees on the hardwood floor and pressed my palms against the thick, decorative wooden baseboard running seamlessly along the base of the shelving unit. To any untrained eye, it was simply a solid, immovable piece of architectural trim, but my hands knew the exact pressure points. I placed my fingers beneath the subtle lower lip of the oak trim and pushed upward with a firm, deliberate surge of force. The hidden internal latches disengaged with a series of dull, heavy clicks. I gripped the edges of the baseboard and pulled it cleanly away from the wall, revealing the dark, narrow void concealed between the floor joists and the structural beams. I reached my arm deep into the dusty, cold darkness of the hidden cavity. My fingers found the familiar cold steel surface of a heavy lockbox. I gripped the sturdy handle and hauled the box out into the dim light of the home office. I set it down carefully on the expensive Persian rug and wiped away a thick layer of built-up dust. The lockbox had sat completely undisturbed in that darkness for 7 long years. I drew the small brass key from my pocket and slid it into the narrow keyhole. It fit with flawless precision. I turned the key, and the heavy internal locking mechanism released with a sharp, satisfying snap. I flipped the metal latches and slowly pushed the heavy steel lid all the way open, bracing myself for whatever horrors lay inside. The box was packed full thick, exhaustively detailed files, organized with meticulous care in Clara's precise, unmistakable handwriting. I pulled the first stack of documents from the steel container, my hands shaking as my eyes moved across the top page. They were comprehensive, highly sensitive bank statements from my commercial construction firm dating back to the months immediately before Clara's devastating fall. But these were not the sanitized, heavily manipulated ledgers Garrett had been showing me. These were the raw, unedited internal financial records she had quietly gathered herself. I turned through the heavy pages, staring in absolute horror at the endless columns of red ink. Garrett had not merely been making poor investment decisions. He had been running a massive, coordinated, breathtakingly brazen embezzlement operation. The documents proved that my son had systematically drained millions in liquid capital straight out of my construction empire's operational accounts. The true scope of his unimaginable betrayal grew darker with every page I turned. He had funneled the stolen millions into his private, recklessly aggressive hedge fund, chasing enormous returns in highly volatile offshore markets. The records laid out staggering losses. He had completely wiped out the stolen capital within months, and he hadn't stopped there. In a desperate bid to recover from that massive financial hemorrhage, he had leveraged the pristine, debt-free commercial properties of my construction firm, quietly taking out enormous, heavily penalized secondary mortgages. The lender listed on the shadowy, unregulated contracts was not a legitimate financial institution. The documentation Clara had uncovered proved that Garrett had borrowed millions in heavily leveraged capital directly from a violent underground criminal syndicate. He had literally mortgaged our family empire to a ruthless cartel to bury his own pathetic failures. Clara had found out. She held the proof to bring his fabricated kingdom down entirely. Garrett tried to violently murder his own mother to conceal his massive thefts. When she miraculously survived that brutal fall down our oak stairs, he chemically silenced her. I stared down at the damning stack of financial ledgers and illicit mortgage contracts, the cold steel of the lockbox pressing against my knees. The air in my home office felt impossibly heavy, thick with the suffocating gravity of a 7-year-old murder attempt. Garrett had not simply betrayed my trust. He had broken the most fundamental laws of nature, attempting to crack his own mother's skull to hide his colossal, cartel-funded failures. When her sheer will to survive foiled his lethal shove down our oak staircase, he simply shifted to chemical warfare, turning her into a silent, vegetative hostage. I packed the irrefutable evidence carefully back into the steel container, my hands moving with the precise mechanical efficiency of an engineer preparing a demolition sequence. I slid the box back into the dark void beneath the floor joists and snapped the heavy oak baseboard cleanly back into place. The physical evidence was secure, but the burning inferno in my chest demanded immediate, calculated action. It was the morning of the third day. My 72-hour window was closing fast, and the transportation team was scheduled to arrive that night. I retreated to the guest bedroom and locked the heavy door behind me. I booted up the encrypted tablet, watching the glowing grids of the live surveillance feeds. The house remained deadly quiet. Nadine had left early for a high-society brunch, and Garrett was allegedly at his downtown headquarters, though the live feed from my old home office told a different story. He was seated behind my mahogany desk, rapidly scrolling through his laptop, his face a taut mask of paranoia. He was sweating, loosening his silk tie as he frantically reviewed his digital accounts. Garrett had always been a man consumed by his own manufactured brilliance, perpetually terrified that his house of cards would buckle under the lightest breeze. He knew the cartel's patience was nearly exhausted, and he desperately needed the funds from my estate to satisfy them. I watched him on the tablet screen, noting the nervous, erratic twitch working through his jaw as he combed through his shadow files. I needed to make certain the audio feed in the office was perfectly calibrated to capture any calls he placed to his underground associates. I tapped the sensitive audio synchronization icon on the tablet's glass interface. It was a microscopic, seemingly insignificant error, born of pure, exhausted adrenaline. In my absolute tunnel-visioned concentration, my finger grazed the diagnostic reset toggle. A sharp gasp seized my throat as the tablet screen flickered violently. Across the house in the ceiling of the home office, a microscopic red light blinked to life directly behind the slotted plastic vents of the smoke detector. It flashed twice, throwing a brief, brilliant ruby glare into the dim shadows of the room. Garrett froze instantly. The rapid clicking of his laptop keys went completely silent. He raised his head slowly, his dark eyes locking with precise, deliberate focus onto the ceiling fixture. Whatever color remained in his face drained away, entirely replaced by a cold, predatory understanding. He knew. In that single fractured second, the elaborate charade we had both been sustaining dissolved completely into the stale morning air. He rose from his chair, slowly, never breaking his gaze from the hidden camera lens. He didn't shout. He didn't rip the smoke detector down from the ceiling. He simply smiled, a terrifying hollow stretching of his thin lips, and walked calmly out of the home office. The tablet screen showed nothing but an empty room, and the silence radiating from it was absolutely deafening. My pulse beat a violent hammering rhythm against my ribs as I waited for his next move. I knew my son better than anyone alive. He would not ring my phone looking for a peaceful resolution. He would not demand answers or attempt to spin yet another web of carefully constructed lies. He would accelerate his timeline immediately and eliminate the threat with extreme, uncompromising force. I tucked the encrypted tablet securely beneath my mattress and slipped a heavy steel wrench into the deep pocket of my trousers. I unlocked the guest bedroom door and stepped out into the long, silent hallway, taking up a position near the top of the grand oak staircase. The agonizing weight stretched through what remained of the morning. Every tick of the antique pendulum clock in the hallway struck like a heavy iron hammer against an anvil. I listened to the wind pressing hard against the window panes and prayed for strength. At exactly noon, the heavy brass deadbolt on the front door clicked sharply. The massive oak door swung open and slammed into the wall with a violent, resounding crash that rang throughout the entire estate. The pristine facade of this dutiful, grieving son was gone completely and permanently. Garrett strode into the grand foyer, his face set in a murderous, uncompromising glare. Nadine trailed nervously behind him, her usual polished arrogance wholly swallowed up by twitching, frantic anxiety. She pressed her designer handbag against her chest, like a shield, her eyes cutting wildly around the empty foyer. But they hadn't come alone. Flanking them were two massive, heavily tattooed men dressed in pristine white medical scrubs. They bore no resemblance to specialized psychiatric nurses. They moved with the heavy, disciplined stride of seasoned cartel enforcers, their eyes sweeping the architecture of the house with cold, tactical precision. Thick muscles strained against the thin cotton of their sleeves, and everything about their posture announced the promise of lethal violence. The transport team had arrived 8 hours early, and they had no intention whatsoever of taking my wife to any legitimate hospital. "Dad!" Garrett barked, his voice ricocheting up the staircase with a harsh, metallic edge. I stepped out of the shadows and planted myself at the top of the stairs, looking down at the monsters who had invaded my home. I did not slouch. I did not tremble. I stood tall, rolling my shoulders back, letting the 70-year-old victim I'd been performing burn away to nothing. "I see your appointment schedule has miraculously opened up." "Garrett," I replied, my voice carrying back down to him with absolute unwavering authority. Garrett glared up at me, his jaw clenching so hard I could practically hear his teeth grinding together. "The game is completely over, old man," Garrett snarled, planting one foot on the bottom stair. "We are not waiting until tonight. The medical transport has arrived to collect my mother, and you are going to stand aside and let them do their job. If you interfere, the nurses have strict authorization to medically sedate you for your own safety." I looked past him to the two massive enforcers who had already reached into their scrub pockets and produced heavy, pre-filled syringes. "They are not taking her anywhere," I stated coldly, gripping the wooden banister with a hand that had spent 40 years forging steel and concrete. "She is staying exactly where she is, and you are going to leave this property immediately." Nadine let out a high, hysterical laugh and stepped out from behind her husband's broad shoulders. "You are completely delusional, you old fool." Her expression contorted into a grotesque mask of arrogant amusement. She didn't merely smirk. She radiated a toxic, triumphant joy that turned my stomach. For years, she had performed the role of the dutiful, loving wife and caretaker, pouring coffee and offering sugary smiles while quietly conspiring against the very woman who had welcomed her into this family. Now standing in the foyer of the house my money had built, flanked by cartel enforcers dressed as medical professionals, she finally let the venom bleed through her polished exterior. "You are completely delusional, you old fool," she repeated, her voice thick with contempt. "Do you honestly believe you have any power left in this situation? You are just a pathetic relic standing in our way." She crossed her arms and shifted her weight onto one hip, thoroughly savoring the spectacle of an old man supposedly facing his total ruin. She genuinely believed I was already broken, a fragile artifact ready to be swept aside alongside my poisoned wife. I looked past her painted face and fixed my gaze squarely on Garrett. My son stepped forward, his large frame deliberately filling the entire width of the grand oak staircase. He positioned himself like a warden blocking a cell door, cutting off every avenue of retreat. The two heavily tattooed men in white medical scrubs mirrored his movement, shifting their weight and sliding their calloused hands into their pockets, fingers undoubtedly curling around the pre-filled syringes they had prepared for my wife. The air in the foyer grew dense, suffocatingly tight with the nearness of violence. Garrett stared up at me, his dark eyes completely stripped of the boy I had raised, stripped of the young man I had sent to university, stripped of every last shred of human empathy. He had fully surrendered to the monstrous version of himself he'd been building in the shadows. He puffed out his chest and adjusted the collar of his expensive dress shirt, preparing to land his final crushing blow on the father he despised. He took another step up the stairs, closing the distance between us, trying to use his youth and physical size to grind me into submission. But I didn't flinch. I didn't yield a single inch of ground. I stood anchored to the hardwood's floor, drawing on 40 years of ruthless corporate negotiations. When he saw that his physical intimidation was failing to produce the terror he wanted, Garrett chose to deploy his carefully rehearsed public narrative instead. He turned his head slightly toward the open front door and raised his voice to a theatrically booming volume. He wanted the two cartel thugs to hear every word, and he wanted any neighbor walking a dog or checking a mailbox to hear it as well. "It seems the dementia must be completely contagious," Garrett announced loudly, his voice bouncing off the high-vaulted ceilings of the foyer with a sickening manufactured grief. "This stress is just too much for his fragile mind. He is having a total psychotic break, Nadine. He needs to go to the psychiatric ward with Mom. They can share a room and receive the specialized cognitive care they both desperately require. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. He was actively laying the groundwork to have me permanently institutionalized right alongside Clara. He was constructing a tragic, highly convincing story for the outside world, a devoted son forced into the agonizing decision to commit both beloved parents due to rapidly advancing synchronized neurological decline. It was a flawless, airtight cover story engineered to hand him absolute, uncontested control over every last piece of my estate. Nadine nodded in loud, exaggerated agreement, playing right along with his twisted pantomime. "It is so tragic, Garrett," she called out, projecting her voice toward the open doorway. We have to do what is best for them, even when they do not understand it themselves." But the theatrical performance collapsed as quickly as it had begun. The moment those loud, dramatic words left his mouth, his entire bearing shifted. The counterfeit sorrow vanished from his eyes, replaced by cold, calculating malice. He lunged up the final 3 stairs with terrifying, predatory speed and crowded directly into my personal space. He grabbed the fabric of my cardigan with both fists and yanked me roughly forward. I let him do it, making sure he felt the illusion of physical control. He brought his face so close to mine I could smell the stale coffee and bitter mints on his breath. His lips grazed my ear, and his voice dropped to a harsh, barely audible whisper that drove a shard of pure ice straight into my spine. "You are going to hand over the original asset documents right now, old man." Garrett hissed, his voice vibrating with lethal, unrestrained menace. "I had my lawyers review the proxy papers you signed. You deliberately sabotaged the signature block, used your old invalid corporate variant. Did you honestly think that pathetic little trick would slip past them before we reached the banking? I know you have the primary titles and the raw financial ledgers concealed somewhere inside this sprawling mausoleum. You are going to walk me straight to them and sign everything over legally, flawlessly right this very second. If you refuse, the entire narrative changes tonight." He tightened his grip on my collar, fingernails digging painfully into my collarbone. "This house has some incredibly unpredictable gas lines, Dad." Garrett whispered, every syllable saturated with murderous intent. "It would be a catastrophic tragedy if a massive explosion suddenly leveled the whole property while we were out finalizing the psychiatric transfer paperwork. A terrible, unpredictable accident, a crippled mother and her senile, helpless husband lost in the middle of the night. Such a terrible shame, but these things happen to old houses. No one would ever question the structural failure." I stared into the black, soulless eyes of the man I had helped bring into this world, feeling the cold weight of the heavy wrench sitting deep in my trouser pocket. He had just openly confessed his willingness to burn his own parents alive to bury his staggering financial failures. There was not a single shred of humanity left inside him worth salvaging. I held his gaze without blinking as his foul breath washed over my face. I needed to keep him entirely focused on me, completely convinced of his own fabricated superiority, so he would not notice the softly blinking light of the micro camera mounted inside the smoke detector directly above his head. He had just delivered his ultimate murderous threat onto a crystal-clear audio feed, transmitting in real time to my secure offshore servers. The trap was fully closed. Every piece of leverage he imagined he held was now utterly worthless. I raised both trembling hands in a slow, deliberately exaggerated gesture of total helpless surrender. "Okay, Garrett," I whispered, allowing a single tear to fall. "You win." Garrett released his grip on my collar, and a sickening smile of absolute triumph spread across his face. He smoothed the wrinkled fabric of his expensive dress shirt and stepped back with the arrogant swagger of a conqueror, claiming his ultimate prize. Nadine let out a long, theatrical sigh of relief, dropping her designer handbag onto a nearby chair and folding her arms across her chest. The two massive cartel enforcers stood perfectly still, their cold eyes moving between me and the heavy wooden doors leading to the master suite, entirely prepared to carry out their grim duties. Garrett extended one hand with his palm facing upward, demanding the physical documents he believed would rescue his crumbling empire. He didn't raise his voice. He had no need to. He was certain he had already won the war. He expected me to sink to my knees, beg for my life, and lead him straight to the hidden compartment where Clara had stashed the raw financial ledgers. He expected the broken, grieving father he had been manipulating for 7 long years. But I did not beg, and I certainly did not kneel. I took one slow, deliberate step backward, carving a small pocket of space between myself and the predators who had invaded my home. I slid my right hand into the pocket of my trousers. Garrett tensed for a fraction of a second, his dark eyes narrowing, perhaps expecting a weapon or the key to a safe. The two men in pristine white medical scrubs shifted their weight hands, moving deeper into their pockets, primed to drive their syringes into my neck at the first sudden movement. But instead of producing a weapon, I simply drew out my encrypted mobile phone. I held the smooth glass device in my palm thumb, resting lightly over the main interface. Nadine rolled her eyes and scoffed loudly. "Who are you going to call, old man?" She mocked, her voice soaked in pure contempt. "The police will never get here in time to save you or your miserable wife. You are entirely alone." I didn't dignify her taunt with a word. I kept my eyes locked on my son, holding the mask of terrified submission in place, while my mind ran with ice-cold mechanical precision. In one fluid motion, I pressed a carefully predetermined sequence of numbers across the illuminated touchscreen. I entered the final digit and hit the execution command. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened at all. The grand foyer held its breath in perfect silence. Garrett let out a harsh, barking laugh and shook his head in mock pity. He took another step, raising his hand to snatch the phone from my grip. Then the entire estate responded. It started as a deep, resonant hum that moved through the hardwood floors and rattled the crystal chandelier hanging high overhead. A loud, mechanical grinding reverberated from somewhere deep within the walls. Before Garrett could even register what was shifting around him, the heavy security systems I had painstakingly installed decades ago slammed into action. Thick, reinforced steel shutters, my own custom military-grade hurricane-proof designs, dropped from concealed housings above every window and exterior door. They crashed down with a deafening, bone-shaking impact that trembled through the foundation. The bright midday sun was instantly and completely extinguished, plunging the foyer into a harsh, artificial gloom lit only by the faint glow of emergency backup lights. The massive steel plates locked into their floor anchors with a succession of heavy metallic thuds, sealing the house like an airtight fortress. The sudden, violent sensory assault triggered an immediate wave of pure panic. Nadine released a shrill, piercing scream that ricocheted off the high ceilings, her hands flying to her ears as she dropped into a crouch against the wall. The 2 cartel thugs abandoned their syringes entirely and drew sleek black firearms from beneath their medical scrubs, heads snapping in every direction, searching for an unseen enemy. Garrett stood frozen in the center of the foyer, his arrogant smile wiped completely away, replaced by raw, unfiltered terror. He spun toward the solid steel barrier now covering the massive front door, and understood in an instant that their only route of escape had been severed. He turned slowly back to face me, the color draining from his face as the full horror of his situation began to register. "You are not going anywhere, Garrett." I said, my voice shedding every last trace of the frail, grieving father. The hollow, defeated tone I had carried for 7 years evaporated, entirely replaced by the deep, commanding authority of a man who had built a construction empire from nothing. I stepped away from the staircase and walked calmly toward the center of the room, posture straight, shoulders broad. I was no longer the prey. I had just locked the predators inside a steel cage alongside me. "What have you done, you insane old fool?" Garrett shouted, his voice cracking with surging panic as he jabbed a finger toward the armed men. "Open these doors right now, or they will kill you where you stand." I ignored his threats completely. I moved with deliberate calm toward the heavy mahogany coffee table at the center of the grand foyer. I raised my left hand and methodically unclasped the heavy silver wristwatch I had worn every single day since Clara gave it to me on our 30th wedding anniversary. I worked the band free and tossed the timepiece onto the polished wooden surface. It landed with a sharp, heavy clatter that cut straight through the suffocating silence of the sealed room. I looked directly into my son's panicked eyes and let the full, unfiltered weight of my vengeance bear down on him. "You forgot who built this house, Garrett," I said, my voice as cold and hard as glacial ice. "I engineered every beam, every wire, and every security protocol in this building to withstand a natural disaster. You are not dealing with a fragile old man. You are dealing with the architect of your entire existence. And more importantly, you forgot who I play poker with on Thursday nights." Garrett stared at the watch lying on the table, his chest heaving as he struggled to absorb my words. "That watch is an active, highly encrypted FBI audio transmitter," I said, pointing down at the glowing dial. Dunk is far more than a street-level contact. The man spent decades as a federal agent. Financial crimes was his specialty. 12 hours ago, he walked a complete, unredacted copy of your cartel ledger straight into the hands of a federal task force. Every word uttered in this room has been captured. Your murder threats, your confessions of embezzlement, every name on the roster of criminals you dragged through my front door. Those steel shutters have a dual purpose. Yes, they seal you in, but more importantly, they hold you in place until the tactical units encircling this property push through. The silence that followed was suffocating. My words settled over the locked foyer like concrete hardening in a mold. Garrett's eyes dropped to the silver wristwatch lying on the coffee table, and he looked at it the way a man looks at a detonator he has just realized is armed. Every trace of that practiced, arrogant curl in his lip, the expression he had worn like a mask, his entire adult life simply collapsed. What remained underneath was something I barely recognized, a frightened, exposed boy whose elaborate lie had finally reached its structural limit. He drew breath to say something, a final threat perhaps, but nothing came. The words never made it out. Then the sound arrived. A solitary whine, thin and distant at first, threading through the reinforced walls of the estate. Within seconds it multiplied, layering into a full, deafening wall of sirens converging on the property. The noise tore through that quiet, well-heeled neighborhood like a blade. Beneath our feet, the floorboards trembled as the weight of armored vehicles ground across the gravel of the driveway. What I had set in motion with Dunk was no bluff, no chess piece without a square to land on. The machinery of federal law enforcement had fully arrived, and its sole purpose was to reduce everything Garrett had constructed to rubble. The two cartel enforcers grasped their situation in an instant. Men like them survive by reading a room, and this room told them they were standing in the center of a coordinated federal ambush they had never seen coming. Intimidating unarmed civilians and collecting cartel debts was their world. Facing an armored tactical breach was something else entirely. One look passed between them. Their firearms hit the hardwood floor almost simultaneously, a pair of sharp metallic reports, as the weapons skidded away toward the baseboard. Both men raised their tattooed arms, laced their fingers behind their skulls, and went slowly to their knees. A firefight with Federal's operators was a death sentence, and they knew the math. Nadine crumpled onto the bottom stair of the Grand Oak staircase, releasing a shrill, hysterical wail and pressing her shaking hands over her face. Garrett, his muscle gone, his exit sealed, his empire dissolving around him, began to fall apart at a physiological level. He staggered in circles, palms beating uselessly against the unyielding steel covering the front entrance. Whatever flaw he was searching for in my engineering, he was never going to find it. A mechanically amplified voice cut through everything, an FBI crisis negotiator, working a bullhorn from the exterior, commanding immediate surrender and the laying down of all weapons. I pulled my encrypted phone from my pocket without any hurry. I gave Garrett not a single glance as he scraped and clawed at the sealed plates. My attention went straight to the security application on the device. I keyed in the 12-digit alphanumeric override, each digit entered with deliberate, unhurried precision, and disengaged the lockdown I had triggered minutes earlier. Deep inside the walls, gears engaged. The shutters over every door and window retracted simultaneously, rising with a grinding mechanical hum. Noonlight came flooding back into the foyer all at once, blinding, disorienting, and in that sudden brightness stood the silhouettes of 24 heavily armed Federal agents, already stacked across the perimeter. The oak doors had barely cleared their frames before the tactical teams were moving through them, a rushing tide of dark body armor, ballistic helmets, and strobing white tactical lights. The speed of it was almost incomprehensible. Sharp, authoritative commands bounced off every surface. Laser sights swept red lines across chests and foreheads. The enforcers were face down and restrained in seconds, zip ties biting deep, agents hauling them toward the exit with no ceremony. Nadine was wrenched up from the stairs, mid-scream, and the cold steel of handcuffs snapped tight around her wrists. Garrett's body simply gave out. His legs folded, and he went down onto the Persian rug in a heap. 2 agents were on him before he finished falling, weight on his back arms cranked behind him. The cuffs clicked shut, and in that precise moment, the thin thread of loyalty he had maintained toward his wife snapped completely. He wrenched his head sideways toward the commanding officer, eyes wide, voice cracking into something high and desperate. "It was all her idea," Garrett screamed, jerking his chin frantically toward Nadine. "She set up the cartel loans. She controlled the shell accounts. She was the one who told me to silence the old woman. I had no choice. I am completely innocent." Nadine went rigid. The cowardice of it hit her somewhere visceral. This man she had schemed beside the man whose ring she wore was attempting to fold her into the wreckage to buy himself air. Something raw and animal came up from her chest. She threw herself against the agents, holding her all thrashing limbs, and fury driving her heel squarely into Garrett's ribs. "You pathetic, lying coward," Nadine screamed, voice ragged, eyes burning. "You pushed her down the stairs. You crushed the pills yourself. You went crawling to the cartel because your fund was a disaster. Don't you dare hang your mess around my neck." The agents hauled her back and forced her through the open doorway. Garrett curled on the floor around his bruised ribs, hollowed out, no dignity, no leverage, nothing left. I crossed the foyer slowly, every step landing with the kind of finality that only 7 years of patient construction can produce. I came to a stop directly over the man who had tried to erase my wife and consume everything I had built. Looking down at him, I searched myself for pity. There was none. That particular room had been emptied long ago. I bent toward him until my face filled his entire field of vision. "You were so certain you were the smartest person in this family," I said, keeping my voice low enough that only he could absorb it beneath the surrounding chaos. You believed you had engineered something airtight, silence your mother, neutralize your father, collect the empire, and use it to paper over your cartel debts. But you built your entire scheme on a flawed foundation. You miscalculated the woman you left at the bottom of those stairs. And you catastrophically underestimated the man you thought you had already beaten. He looked up at me with something desperate still clinging to his expression, some last ember of hope that a deal existed somewhere. I leaned in and put it out. In that power of attorney you strong-armed me into signing, it's worth nothing, I said quietly. I executed my corporate duress signature. Every line of it is void. You walk away with absolutely nothing. He was taken out in federal custody, attempted murder, elder abuse, and racketeering charges stacked against him. The van doors sealed behind him, and whatever sounds he made as it pulled away were swallowed by the steel. I remained on the cold gravel of the driveway and watched the red and blue lights thin out and vanish around the corner. 7 years. The weight of that, the grief, the surveillance, the slow, methodical assembly of an ironclad trap lifted off my chest for the first time. What replaced it wasn't relief exactly. It was a bone-deep exhaustion, the kind that only arrives when the last load-bearing wall of a demolition finally falls. The estate loomed at my back, enormous and silent. It had once represented everything I had ever built. Now it was simply the site of a crime, a structure contaminated by Garrett's greed, by what had happened on that oak staircase, by 7 years of calculated cruelty conducted within its rooms. I could not remain there. The walls themselves had absorbed too much. I put it on the market the following month. The property sold, and with it went the last physical anchor to that chapter. I moved to a quiet waterfront property on the Chesapeake Bay near Annapolis, Maryland, a place where the city's poison couldn't reach me. The open water and the steady breeze off the bay worked on my mind the way nothing else had. Rebuilding what remained of my family became the sole project that mattered. The weeks after the arrests were consumed by federal debriefs and meetings with corporate attorneys. Every document, every recording, every thread of financial evidence I had assembled went into the hands of the investigators. The scale of the embezzlement left the authorities visibly shaken. The layers of deception my son had engineered over years were far more elaborate than even the task force had anticipated. What came next in the courtroom was merciless. The prosecution dismantled their sprawling network of deception piece by piece. I stood in that packed courtroom and watched in silence as my former son worked desperately to win the jury over. Spinning one fabricated story after another, angling to recast himself as the tragic casualty of bad luck and bad timing. But the raw, unedited financial ledgers and the crystal-clear audio recordings tore his fragile defense apart at the seams. Garrett and Nadine were sitting in maximum security, holding cells their bail flatly denied by a federal judge who had taken one look at the scope of their crimes and recognized the flight risk for exactly what it was. They were waiting out their inevitable lengthy federal sentences, stripped of the wealth they had stolen and the manufactured respectability they had hidden behind. The underground cartel syndicate had been broken apart entirely by the financial task force, and the assets drained from my construction firm had been methodically traced, frozen, and fully recovered. I spent long, grueling hours working alongside federal auditors to reconstruct the integrity of my company from the inside out. We cut out the infected tissue and rebuilt the foundation of trust with our legitimate partners. My business stood on solid ground once more. 6 months on the bitter winter had finally released its grip, giving way to the clear, forgiving warmth of an early spring morning. I pushed through the sliding glass doors of the Neurological Rehabilitation Center in Bethesda, Maryland, a steaming paper cup in my right hand. Every trace of that sterile, soul-crushing environment of the previous corrupt facility was gone. This place was something else entirely vibrant, with green plants and open, airy spaces staffed by professionals who treated their patients as human beings worth saving. My true victory was waiting at the far end of a bright corridor. I made my way toward the open doorway of a private corner suite, my heart carrying a steady, cautious hope. Clara was settled into a comfortable armchair beside the large window, the soft gold of the morning light falling gently across her. The pale, lifeless cast that had haunted her face for 7 long years had disappeared entirely. Her skin held a warm, healthy color, and she sat upright under her own recovering strength rather than artificial restraints propping her in place. It had taken months of intensive, painstaking medical work to slowly and safely clear the lethal accumulation of heavy metals and first-generation antipsychotics from her fragile system. There were days of terrifying uncertainty, moments when I wore grooves into hospital waiting room floors, convinced the chemical damage had crossed some irreversible threshold. The doctors had cautioned me about the unpredictable nature of severe neurological trauma. But my brilliant, stubbornly resilient wife had clawed her way back from that suffocating darkness with a quiet, ferocious will that left me completely humbled. I stepped softly into the room. Clara turned toward the sound of my footsteps. Her eyes, once buried beneath a thick, unnatural fog, were clear and fully alive. The sharp, analytical intelligence I had fallen in love with 4 decades earlier flickered there, unmistakable and radiant. The depth of recognition in her gaze was nothing short of a miracle. I crossed to her side and set the warm paper cup on the small table within her reach. I had made the coffee exactly as she'd always taken it, stirring in precisely 1 teaspoon of honey and a small splash of cream, the same way I had prepared it every morning before her world was taken from her. She glanced down at the cup, then slowly extended her trembling fingers and brushed them softly against my weathered hand. That simple, tentative touch sent a warmth through me that reached places 7 years of cold grief had left hollow. She curled her fingers around the cup, steadied her grip, and lifted it carefully to her lips. She took a slow, deliberate sip and let her eyes close for just a moment, savoring the small, reclaimed pleasure of something ordinary and familiar. Then she set the cup down and looked straight at me, a teasing smile finding its way to her lips. "Roland, this coffee is a bit weak today." A wave of pure emotion broke through my chest and took the last of my composure with it. That simple, beautifully coherent sentence, casual and clear and entirely hers, was the finest thing I had ever heard in my life. I went to my knees beside her chair and folded my arms gently around her shoulders as hot, silent tears ran down my face. I held her close, feeling the steady, reassuring rhythm of her heartbeat against my chest. Every commercial property, every business deal, every structure I had ever raised from the ground, none of it amounted to a fraction of what this single moment was worth. We had endured the deepest betrayal imaginable. We had walked through a darkness that most people never come close to, and we had come through the other side intact. The nightmare was finished. The road ahead would still demand patience and sustained effort, but we would walk it side by side. The tears were different now. They carried no grief, no despair, no suffocating fear. They were pure, unguarded joy. I pressed my forehead against hers, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, listening to the quiet, steady cadence of her breath. I had lost a monster, a ruthless, calculating predator who had worn the face of my own son for years. But from the wreckage of that betrayal after the hardest fight of my life, I had gotten back the one person who had never been replaceable. If you've stayed with me all the way to the end of this story, then you already know some things cost you more than you ever expected to pay. And some things, when you finally get them back, turn out to be worth every single ounce of that cost. I spent 7 years inside a nightmare that I hadn't seen coming. 7 years of watching the woman I loved disappear, of being quietly pushed to the edges of my own life by people I had trusted completely. I believe God kept a thread of clarity alive in me during those years, just enough to hold on, just enough to keep looking, just enough to act when the moment finally came. What I lost along the way, my son, my home, my sense of safety inside my own family, I will carry that forever. But what I got back at the end of that corridor on a quiet spring morning was worth more than anything I had ever built. If this story leaves you with anything, let it be this. Never sign away your life's work under pressure. If someone is rushing you toward a signature, slow down. That urgency is a warning, not a deadline. If something feels wrong about the people caring for someone you love, trust that feeling. Investigate. Do not wait for proof to come to you. Patience is not weakness. Sometimes the most powerful move you can make is to say nothing, watch everything, and let the truth build its own case. And if you have a person in your life worth fighting for, fight. Quietly, methodically, all the way to the end. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment and tell me what stayed with you. And if you haven't yet, come back for more by subscribing to Dad Revenge. I'll be here. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself and take care of the people who need you.